You might have the reflex of saying that this whole idea of psychiatry is a pretty young science. When did this really start creeping into the law? A real landmark case is from 1841, and it's the case of Daniel Macnaghten. Daniel Macnaghten was 28 years old in 1841, and he started to complain to the chief of police in Glasgow, where he lived, that he was being persecuted by the Tories, which was a political party in power in the English Parliament at the time. The Prime Minister was a Tory, and he felt that he was being pursued by their spies and that this was a problem. So he went to the police and said, "You got to do something about this. The government is spying on me." And the police just decided that this guy's problem was not their problem. They told him to go away. However, 2 years later, he had traveled to London by this point from Glasgow, and he walked up behind a man who he thought was the Prime Minister, who was sending spies after him. He thought this was Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, and he shot him in the back. Now, as it turned out, this was not actually Sir Robert Peel. The man that he shot was actually just Sir Robert Peel's private secretary and not the Prime Minister himself, which, of course, was a relief for Sir Robert Peel. However, the secretary himself died of the wound, which was sad for Mr. Drummond, also for Mr. Peel. Now, Macnaghten, when he was arrested for this, he sought to justify his actions by saying that the Tories are, unfortunately, they're back in my city in Glasgow. They've compelled me to do this because they persecute me wherever I go. They've entirely destroyed my peace of mind. I can't live like this. I had to do something. It can be proved by evidence that their spies are following me everywhere, and that's all I have to say. And he had been complaining about this for 2 years, since 1841. And so listening to this account from this guy and realizing that he really didn't understand what was going on very well, his defense lawyers argued that Macnaghten's delusions had led to a breakdown of moral sense. He was overcome by this delusion that he was being chased and spied on by the government. This made him lose his self-control, and they said, according to medical experts, that left him in a state where he was no longer a reasonable and responsible being and can't be held responsible for his actions. This is what his defense lawyers said, and they actually won the case for him. The jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity. The result was that he was remanded to a mental hospital. He lived in mental hospitals for the rest of his life until dying 22 years after the murders. It might say, well, if he stayed in mental institutions for the rest of his life, that's not really much of a win. Well, he would have been killed if he had been found guilty of the murder. So compared to being hanged or whatever it is, 22 years of subsequent life was a better option as far as he saw it. Now, this is Queen Victoria, and she wasn't very happy about all this because she was queen at the time and assassinations were kind of getting popular in Europe in the 19th century, so she got very upset about the fact that Macnaghten was found not guilty, and she was concerned that she might be subject to assassination attempts by people who would then say, "Oh yeah, I killed the queen, but I kind of had to because she was spying on me in my dreams," or whatever it is. So she asked the leading judges of the kingdom to state what the rules on this actually were, following what had happened with Daniel Macnaghten, and their answer has actually been influential in formulating the insanity defense in the English-speaking world. This is what they said. They said, okay, so we figured it out. If you want to establish a defense on the ground of insanity, then here's what you have to do. You have to clearly prove that at the time you committed the act, you were laboring under such a defect of reason from disease of the mind that you did not know the nature and quality of the act you were doing, or if you did know the nature and quality of the act, that you didn't know that what you were doing was wrong. This is way back in the 1840s that the Queen got this from the judges of the land, and it's been very influential. The rule in Macnaghten's case is still effectively in use today, which we'll go into. It's worth noting that if it had actually been applied to Daniel Macnaghten's case, he probably would have been found guilty. He would have not have passed the rule in Macnaghten's case, even though he was acquitted. So maybe Queen Victoria could take some solace there, and the way that it was formulated would have protected her from other Macnaghtens assassinating her. But luckily for Macnaghten, the rule didn't exist yet, and he was able to get away without being hanged. Canada's criminal insanity law was inspired by the rule, and still is inspired by the rule in Macnaghten's case, the way that those judges formulated it about 170 years ago. Initially, it was simply quoted in cases as coming from common law rules, but eventually it was explicitly stated in the Criminal Code, Section 16 of the current Canadian Criminal Code, what's generally referred to by criminal lawyers as the NCR defense, NCR short for not criminally responsible. And what it states is, no person is criminally responsible for an act committed or an omission made while suffering from a mental disorder that rendered the person incapable of appreciating the nature and quality of the act or omission, or of knowing that it was wrong. This is very close to the same wording that comes from 170 years ago. And we'll break it down in subsequent chapters here, but it ultimately comes down to this. At the time of the offense, you suffered from a mental disorder, and that mental disorder caused you to be incapable of either knowing what you were doing or knowing that what you were doing was wrong. So we'll go into depth on each of those elements and try and figure out exactly what this defense means and when it applies.